Hello and welcome to France 24 and on RFI. Our guest today for this exclusive interview is the President of Senegal and also President in Office of the African Union, Macky Sall. Hello, Mr. President.
Hello, Mark.
Together with me, Christophe Waboué with RFI. Mr. President, hello.
Hello, Christophe.
Mr. President, on June 3rd, you met President Putin, President of Russia, in Sochi, in order to open food corridors for the export of wheat, grain, fertilizers. The question is, indeed, the worry or the concern about famine, hunger crisis, and are there other sources of supply possible? When the Secretary General of the UN is talking about hurricanes of hunger, is it dramatizing?
When I went to Sochi, on behalf of Africa, the reason was that we already have a shortage of grains in Africa and also a shortage of fertilizers. You know that African agriculture is very poor, not very productive, because we don't use a lot of fertilizers. On average, we have about 17 kilograms per hectare, while in Europe you use about 100 kilograms. So we had a poor agriculture. And now the price of fertilizers has gone up by 3 times. So when I saw President Putin, I had 3 messages on behalf of Africa. First, we should leave no stone unturned to free grain to be exported through Odessa and through the Black Sea. So Russia should not stand in the way of those exports. The second request is that we want to have access to Russian grain and mostly to fertilizers, ammonia, potash, urea, and the like. Those are important components that we bought in Ukraine and Russia, for wheat production especially. Our third request is we want the end of the war, and we want a de-escalation, and we want discussions to be initiated with Ukraine and other parties, the other stakeholders to that conflict.
Well, indeed.
The Secretary General did not exaggerate. We really have a shortage. And if fertilizers do not reach Africa, which is in wintering, there will be no crops. We already have supply difficulties with wheat. If on top of that local grains are not produced, then we will have a serious famine.
Well, following this meeting, there was also the President of the African Union Commission, Fatima Mahamat. You said, I'm reassured, but for the time being, there's no viable solution, neither through the Black Sea nor through other routes. A week later, don't you have the feeling that you have been too optimistic?
I am reassured. I still am optimist. I am optimistic, all the more so because he said things in front of Moussa Faki, and his Minister for Foreign Affairs reiterated the same thing in Istanbul 2 days ago. And Russia is committed. If mines are cleared from waters facing the Odessa harbor, it commits, if ships can be checked, not to stand in the way of grain exports from Ukraine. He even committed, he said, if Ukraine wants to use other ports such as Mariupol, they can secure a security corridor. So until proven otherwise, I have seen no reason not to be reassured. So now we must make sure that mines are cleared, that the UN be involved and all the stakeholders be involved so that we can find a solution.
President Putin said he was ready to free the grain and fertilizer from the Ukraine under the condition that the Western world would lift the sanctions against Russia.
No conditions. There was no conditions related to sanctions.
But he asked it from you. He asked it.
No, the Russian products. But on the Ukrainian products, they say if the mines are clear from the port, and it's a about carrying grains, Russia will not stand in the way. I even said, Ukrainians say that if they clear the mines, you will come into the harbor. But Putin committed himself not to come into the harbor, and the foreign minister repeated that. So exports can be done through the Black Sea. There are other alternatives that might be difficult through the Danube. I don't know.
Did President Putin ask for a partial lifting of the sanctions against Russia? Will you ask that from Emmanuel Macron, that you will see this Friday, or other Western leaders?
No. Access to Russian products. We in Africa are facing a difficulty that relates to the sanctions on the SWIFT payment system. Banks most of the time are connected with European banks, and they cannot pay as they used to do. When at the same time, China, other countries keep on trading with Russia. The US, the UK, EU, they still trade gas with Russia, but we can't because of the payment system. That's why I said we're not accusing EU for sanctioning grains, but those sanctions on SWIFT and on some oligarchs that produce grains and fertilizers, the impact is such that banks don't want to work with them, and this war generated the situation, and we feel the full impact of those sanctions, and we have supplies difficulties. So we have to work with our European partners to find a way to solve those difficulties in order to regulate the market and secure an adequate supply of grains and mostly of fertilizers.
During this Sochi meeting, you reminded your Russian counterpart that the majority of the African countries, including Senegal, avoided to condemn Russia at the United Nations. You even added, in spite of tremendous pressures, we can imagine Emmanuel Macron in the backstage.
No, there was no pressure from Emmanuel Macron, at least in Senegal.
Don't you fear being termed an accomplice of a country that aggressed its neighbor and who's accused of war crimes and blackmail?
What makes me an accomplice? To go to Russia, to speak to him?
No, for having not voted. I mean, your abstention.
Abstention is a way of voting, neither in favor nor against. It is a position. When you vote, you can vote yes, no, or abstain. You should not let your imagination run wild. Those are opinions stated by states. We have opinions that should be taken on board. On Russia, for instance, within the Human Rights Council, we voted in favor of creating
in Geneva
an investigation committee in Geneva, yes. So sometimes we vote yes if we believe it looks sensible and consistent. When we don't think the same way or we don't want to take position, we abstain. This is not about siding with Russia. It has nothing to do with it.
Can we ask you, from a moral point of view, for you, in this war, there is an aggressor and a victim.
If you look at my tweets, 2 days after the intervention in Ukraine, I did that. Yes.
Well, I'd like to hear you.
I made a joint statement with the chairperson of the AU Commission, Moussa Faki, to communicate that issue, condemn the intervention, and have Ukrainian sovereignty complied with. I should speak to Russia when I believe that the market is blocked because, one, a major supply Ukraine can no longer export. It is my duty and the duty of Africans to make President Putin aware of that reality. So I asked him to work with the UN to lift that constraint. It's also our duty to bring to the attention of those who slapped sanctions that those sanctions have an impact, and currently we cannot access supplies, critical supplies, such as grains and fertilizers.
Well, upon your return from Sochi, you said last weekend in Accra that you are going to go to Kiev to meet with President Zelensky. It was supposed to take place, and it didn't take place. Are you still welcome in Kiev, Mr. President?
Well, first, I never was invited to Kiev.
But you stated your will to go there.
Yes, because I wanted to be in a very neutral position. But Ukraine Ukraine requested us to communicate with the African Union. I conveyed that information, and the Extended Bureau accepted that request and mandated me to go and see Putin to show African position and make our requests. So as quickly as we can, we're going to set up this meeting between President Zelensky and the African Union. If he invites us to Kiev, we will go.
In the Senegal, Mr. President, the opposition, Yodi Askaroui, demonstrated peacefully yesterday in the streets of Dakar, but threatened to do everything to prevent the parliamentary elections of July 31st if their leader, Ousmane Sonko, are excluded from the vote. If a solution is not found for the national list of the opposition, which is currently being invalid, don't you fear a flaring up of the streets like it happened in Dakar in March 2021?
There is no point in looking at March 2021 as the alpha and omega. The general election is organized under an election code and an election system that we have, and we are proud of it. If we are a stable country, this is not by chance. It's not the first time that we set up elections. We have an election system which is the end product of consultation and consolidations. And the last code was registered, it was discussed for 18 months, and it generated this code that prepared the ground for the general election. But we have to meet its requirements. For instance, the gender parity law. We cannot go back. And an election list without gender parity is not admissible. A list that does not meet the requirements is not admitted. We were taken out because our list of national substitutes had a technical glitch, but it's the law, and you have to comply with it. Now, there have been blackmail attempts to withdraw from the elections. That's something else. The country has to go through with those elections. The Constitutional Council has made a decision, and we obeyed. The Dakar list was not admissible. The Council said the Interior Minister has to comply. The Interior Minister obeyed and accepted the changes. And today, this Dakar list can compete because it complied with that decision. When it comes to the opposition, they still have to obey that decision. That should not be seen as unconscionable.
Yeah, but there could be obstructions.
Yes, but if there are obstructions or difficulties, they can be managed in compliance with our regulations.
Mr. President, in Mali, the junta stated last week that the transition will last 24 months. Isn't it an affront to all the heads of states of ECOWAS, I see you smiling, who gathered 2 days before in Accra to try and find a compromise? Aren't the army of Bamako laughing at you and taking you for a ride?
I don't think so. I don't think they're laughing at us. It might be awkward.
No, it's not a blunder, it's a strong position.
The mediator did submit this plan to the Conference of Heads of State. 24 months, starting in March 2021. And then conditions were set. And the conference discussed, there was a long discussion, and at the end of the day we said, we're not going to make a decision now. We'll request the mediator to take note. We take note of the situation, and we want him to use the coming month to fill out the roadmap and know specifically what the commitments and the timeline is. And then on the 3rd of July, we can discuss for good whether we should lift sanctions or not.
So a compromise is still possible?
Yes, it is. Obviously, it was awkward to put this out, but it was indeed the end product of their agreement with the mediator. That's the truth. In July, with ECOWAS, we'll see whether sanctions should be lifted, sanctions that have a huge impact on civilians.
One last question, Mr. President. Our time is almost up. In Guinea, the army goes even further. They want a transition of 3 years, 36 months. Sanctions of the ECOWAS were foreseen. nothing has happened, does it mean that the army of Conakry have nothing to fear?
I believe that we see clearly that the transitional government in Guinea takes the stance that they have access to the sea, they have their own currency, and they might display more resiliency vis-à-vis sanctions from ECOWAS. But none of our countries has an interest to draw away from its neighbors and community. But clearly, we have to overhaul the system as it works, because the difficulty with ECOWAS and with African Union is that not so much the interference, but the massive impact of countries able to neutralize the works of the Security Council with the veto powers. Those countries believe that they are supported by those powers, and they don't want to comply with what ECOWAS said. So in the past, we would intervene militarily. That might still be a solution, but that would be an extreme solution, undesirable. But if we are left with no resources vis-à-vis countries that flout common rule, that's a problem. But it's not specific to Africa. It's the same difficulty faced by the Security Council with many countries in the world, and that's why we say that there is a need to overhaul the UN system, including the membership of the Security Council as it stands. People neutralize the UN work, and we cannot find solutions to practical issues in our countries.
Thank you, Mr. President, for granting us this interview, and thank you for watching us on our both channels, France 24 and RFI.